It is the evening of June 23, 1942, and a Focke-Wulf 190 is coming down over South Wales with its wheels lowered and its pilot grinning beneath his oxygen mask. Below him lies a neat grass aerodrome, hedgerows stitched around its perimeter, a scattering of huts at its edge. He waggles his wings, the traditional signal of a fighter pilot announcing a kill, and eases the throttle back. To Oberleutnant Armin Faber, Gruppenadjutant of III Gruppe, Jagdgeschwader II, this is a French airfield, and he has just shot down a British fighter over the Channel. He touches down smoothly on the grass, taxis toward the dispersal huts, and begins to shut down his engine, already composing in his mind the account he will give of the day's fighting. He is wrong about almost everything. The stretch of water beneath him minutes earlier was not the English Channel, but the Bristol Channel. The men, now walking toward his aircraft, are not fellow officers of the Luftwaffe, but ground crew of the Royal Air Force. The airfield is not in Brittany, but Carmarthenshire, and it is called RAF Pembrey, home to an RAF gunnery school with barely a rifle between its personnel. Within moments, a duty pilot named Sergeant Jeffreys, armed with nothing more lethal than a flare pistol, will haul himself onto the wing of Faber's fighter and take him prisoner. And with that, almost by accident, the Royal Air Force will acquire the one thing it had wanted more than almost anything else in the summer of 1942, an intact, flyable example of the aircraft that had been quietly terrifying its pilots for the better part of a year. This is not a story about a weapon designed in a laboratory or built on a production line under bombing raids. It is a story about a navigational error, a moment of overconfidence, and the extraordinary intelligence windfall that followed. For 9 months, the FW-190 had outclassed the Spitfire in the skies over northern France, and Fighter Command had been unable to answer the most basic question of all. What, precisely, were they dealing with? Faber's mistake would answer it in a single afternoon, and in doing so change the way the RAF fought its most important adversary for the remainder of the war. It matters because intelligence in the history of air combat has rarely arrived so completely, so unexpectedly, or so free of cost. To understand why one wrongly landed airplane could matter so much, it helps to go back to September 1941, when RAF pilots flying sweeps over northern France began reporting a fighter unlike anything they had previously encountered. It was faster than their Spitfire Mark Versus at most altitudes. It climbed harder, accelerated harder, and rolled into a turn with a speed that seemed to defy the aircraft's stubby, broad-winged silhouette. Pilots who tried to follow it into a tight turning fight, the maneuver that had always been the Spitfire's trump card, found the German fighter simply flicking away in the opposite direction before they could bring their guns to bear. Fighter Command began calling it, with a certain grim respect, the butcher bird. The scale of the problem became apparent in the loss figures. Through the winter of 1941 and into 1942, RAF fighter sweeps over the French coast were suffering losses that senior officers found difficult to explain to their own satisfaction, let alone to the Air Ministry. At points during this period, the exchange rate in air combat ran as unfavorably as 4 RAF aircraft lost for every German fighter destroyed, a reversal of the arithmetic that had underpinned British confidence since the Battle of Britain. Worse, nobody in Fighter Command could say with any precision why. Silhouette recognition from gun camera film and pilot reports gave only an outline. Engine performance, armament, weight, stalling behavior, the altitudes at which the new German fighter was strong and the altitudes at which it might be weak, all of this remained guesswork, pieced together from fragments of combat reports written by exhausted men moments after landing. Part of the difficulty was that the RAF had grown used to being the side with the technical advantage. The Spitfire had carried Fighter Command through the Battle of Britain in 1940 against the Messerschmitt Bf-109, and the tactics, training, and self-confidence built during that victory had never really been revised. The arrival of the FW-190 punctured that assumption almost overnight. Designed by Kurt Tank and powered by a large air-cooled radial engine rather than the liquid-cooled inline units favored by both the Spitfire and the Bf-109, the German fighter looked on paper like a step backwards, heavier and less elegant than its predecessor. In the air, it was nothing of the sort. Its wide, sturdy undercarriage made it forgiving on rough airstrips, its heavier cannon armament hit harder per burst than a Spitfire's, and pilots on both sides who flew it came away describing it as one of the finest fighters of the war. The obvious solution, gathering as much intelligence as possible on a captured example, proved maddeningly hard to achieve. No FW-190 had come down anywhere the Allies could reach it. Wrecks that fell in occupied France were denied to British intelligence by the simple fact of German control of the ground, and photo reconnaissance could establish little more than an outline and a rough estimate of size. The problem grew serious enough that British planners began drawing up genuinely audacious schemes to solve it by force. One proposal involved a commando raid on a French airfield specifically to seize an FW-190 and fly or ferry it home, a plan that would have risked the lives of a raiding party for a single aircraft. Another, more theatrical still, involved sending a German-speaking RAF pilot into France disguised in a Luftwaffe uniform, flying a captured Messerschmitt Bf-109, with instructions to talk his way onto an FW-190 unit's airfield, demand a fresh aircraft in fluent German, and simply fly it back across the Channel before anyone thought to question him. Both plans were judged too likely to fail, or too likely to cost lives, and neither was carried out. By June 1942, Fighter Command still had no answer to the aircraft that was quietly winning the war of attrition above the Pas-de-Calais, and every month that passed without one cost more Spitfires and more pilots. What the RAF eventually received, it received for nothing, and by mistake. Armin Faber was not a junior pilot chancing his arm. He was the Gruppenadjutant, effectively the staff officer, of III Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader II, based at Morlaix in Brittany, and on June 23 he had obtained special permission to fly an operational sortie alongside the unit's 7th Staffel. The mission was an interception of a formation of RAF Boston bombers returning from a raid, escorted by several squadrons of Spitfires over the Channel. In the resulting dogfight, Faber claimed to have shot down a Spitfire flown by Sergeant František Treitnar, a Czech pilot who bailed out and survived. But in the confusion of the engagement, Faber became separated from the rest of his staffel, and in the disorientation that followed, he made the error that would define the rest of his war. He mistook the Bristol Channel for the English Channel and turned north, believing he was heading for home. Running low on fuel and searching the ground for a landing strip, Faber spotted what he took to be a Luftwaffe airfield below him. He performed his celebratory wing waggle, an act witnessed with total disbelief by the men on the ground, lowered his undercarriage and brought the Focke-Wulf down onto the grass at RAF Pembrey without so much as a bumpy landing. Pembrey was a training station, home to the RAF's air gunnery school, and had almost no weapons on the premises. The duty pilot, Sergeant Jeffries, grabbed the only armed device to hand, a very pistol used for firing signal flares, and ran out to the taxiing aircraft. He clambered onto the wing before Faber had a chance to restart his engine and taxi clear, and held the flare gun on him until it became apparent from the look on Faber's face that the German officer had finally understood exactly where he had landed. He was said to have been so despondent at the realization of what he had handed the enemy that he made an unsuccessful attempt on his own life shortly afterwards. He was taken by Group Captain David Atcherley to RAF Fairwood Common for interrogation, and from there into captivity that would eventually take him to a prisoner of war camp in Canada, from which he attempted to escape twice before being repatriated late in the war owing to ill health. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The aircraft itself, a Focke-Wulf FW-190A-3 bearing the work number 313 and still carrying the yellow-tipped cockerel emblem of III Gruppe on its cowling, was the first FW-190 to fall into Allied hands substantially undamaged. Engineers at Pembrey wasted no time. Within a day of the landing, the fighter had been examined where it stood, photographed from every angle, and its cockpit instruments and placards noted and translated before it was carefully dismantled for the journey inland. It was moved by road to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, a convoy of lorries carrying, wing by wing and fuselage section by fuselage section, the answer to a problem that had defeated British intelligence for the better part of a year. There it was reassembled, repainted in RAF camouflage, and issued the service serial MP499, though it retained, whether by oversight or by a certain wry sentiment among the ground crew, the original squadron emblem beneath its new paint. It made its first flight in British colors on July 3, 1942, under the RAE's chief test pilot, Wing Commander H.J. Willie Wilson, a pilot whose job it now was to discover, in the air, everything the aircraft's previous owner had never intended the RAF to learn. In roughly 9 hours of flying, RAE test pilots gathered more usable intelligence on the aircraft's true performance than 9 months of combat reports had managed. The Focke-Wulf was then flown to the Air Fighting Development Unit at Duxford in Cambridgeshire, where it was placed in direct comparative trials against the RAF's frontline fighters, most significantly against the newly arrived Spitfire Mark IX. The results of that July 1942 trial were sobering and precise in equal measure. At 2,000 feet, the Focke-Wulf proved 7 to 8 miles per hour faster than the Spitfire 9. At 5,000 feet, the two aircraft were essentially equal. Higher up, at 8,000 and again at 15,000 feet, the Spitfire held a modest speed advantage of 5 to 8 miles per hour, before the German fighter clawed a little of it back at 18,000 feet. More important than any of these figures was what the trial revealed about maneuverability. The FW-190 outperformed the Spitfire in almost every respect except one, the classic turning circle, where the British fighter's superior wing loading still gave it the edge. What made the German aircraft so lethal in combat was its exceptional rate of roll, which allowed a pilot who found himself being outturned to simply flick the aircraft over into a diving turn in the opposite direction and be gone before his pursuer could react. For the first time, Fighter Command had documented proof of what had been killing its pilots and precise figures for the altitudes at which a Spitfire pilot should and should not attempt to fight. That intelligence traveled quickly into official tactical guidance. Pilots were now told, with something approaching certainty, not to try to outroll a Focke-Wulf, to exploit the Spitfire's tighter turning circle wherever possible, and to be especially wary in the altitude bands where the German fighter held a genuine edge. Captured MP499 did not stay a laboratory curiosity either. It was passed to number 1426 Enemy Aircraft Circus Flight, which flew it from Duxford and later from Collyweston in Northamptonshire on demonstration tours around RAF stations, giving hundreds of operational pilots their first look at the silhouette, the engine note, and the flying characteristics of the aircraft they had only previously seen from the wrong end of a gun camera. It remained in RAF service, in one capacity or another, until it was struck off charge on September 18, 1943. The Faber incident invites an obvious comparison, one that would play out on the opposite side of the world almost exactly a month later. On June 4, 1942, a Japanese Mitsubishi Zero, flown by Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga, was struck by ground fire during a raid on Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands and attempted a forced landing on nearby Akutan Island. Unlike Faber's smooth, deliberate touchdown, Koga's aircraft flipped onto its back in boggy ground, killing him instantly, but leaving the airframe largely intact. American forces did not find it for several weeks, and it took months more to recover, ship, and restore to flying condition. When it finally flew again in American markings, it handed the United States Navy the same category of gift the RAF had received at Pembrey, a full understanding of a feared enemy fighter's true strengths and, crucially, its weaknesses, information that shaped tactics against the Zero for the remainder of the Pacific War. Both incidents share the same essential shape, a single aircraft delivered by accident rather than by daring, that did more for its captor's air war than any amount of speculation from combat reports ever could. The difference lies in effort. Where the Americans had to salvage a broken aircraft from an Alaskan bog, the British inherited a perfectly serviceable fighter that had, in effect, landed itself and taxied to a stop of its own accord. The material impact of Faber's mistake is, on its own, modest and easy to overstate. One captured aircraft did not reverse the RAF's fortunes overnight, and the FW-190 continued to trouble fighter command well into 1943, particularly in its later, more powerful variants that MP-499 could never represent. What the incident did provide was certainty in place of guesswork, at a moment when uncertainty was costing lives every week over the Channel coast. The comparative trials at Duxford gave squadron commanders hard numbers rather than impressions, and hard numbers change tactics faster than rumor ever can. There is also a case that the psychological value of the capture outweighed even its technical worth. Word of an FW-19. Oh, sitting in British markings on an English airfield, its pilot in captivity traveled through fighter command's messes within days, and for men who had spent 9 months regarding the butcher bird as something close to unbeatable, the sight of one tamed, painted RAF gray and being flown by their own test pilots was its own kind of morale, quietly restored. No complete example of Faber's own aircraft survives today. After its RAF service ended in 1943, the airframe was eventually scrapped, and the only known relic of MP-499, a partially refurbished section of front cockpit and its armored windscreen, still bearing traces of the wartime RAF paint applied at Farnborough, can be seen today at the Shoreham Aircraft Museum in Kent, alongside photographs and eyewitness accounts of the affair. It is a modest survival for an incident that once occupied the urgent attention of the Air Ministry, but it is enough. The fragment sits in its case much as the story itself sits in the wider history of the air war, unglamorous, almost accidental, and disproportionately significant. Faber himself never flew in combat again. Shipped eventually to a prisoner of war camp in Canada, he made 2 attempts to escape before ill health saw him repatriated in the closing months of the war, a quiet and largely undocumented postscript to a single afternoon that had briefly made him one of the most consequential Luftwaffe pilots in the Western theater, entirely against his own intentions. Sergeant František Treitnar, the Czech pilot whose Spitfire Faber had shot down that same afternoon, survived his own encounter with the ground and lived to see the war's end, a detail that lends the whole episode a strange symmetry. 2 young airmen on opposite sides of the same brief engagement, both walking away from aircraft they never expected to lose. Return, for a moment, to that grass strip in Carmarthenshire on the evening of June 23, 1942. A German officer waggles his wings in celebration, lowers his wheels, and lands his fighter with total confidence among men he believes to be his own. He is wrong about the country beneath him, wrong about the war he thinks he is winning, and wrong in the most immediate and personal sense about the next 5 minutes of his life. Everything that follows, the flare pistol on the wing, the disassembly and the lorry ride to Farnborough, the fresh coat of RAF paint over a Luftwaffe cockerel, the stopwatches at Duxford, the tactical notes that found their way into pilots' briefings for months afterward, follows from a single wrong turn over the Bristol Channel. It is tempting, looking back, to make Faber's error sound almost comic, a pilot so disoriented he handed his enemy exactly what they needed. But the men flying against the FW-190, in the weeks and months after his capture would not have called it comic. They would have called it the moment the odds shifted, however slightly, back in their favor. No commando raid brought that aircraft home. No disguised pilot talked his way past a French sentry to steal it. It arrived because one German officer, tired, low on fuel, and certain he was among friends, waggled his wings over the wrong stretch of water. Britain did not have to fight for its intelligence coup that summer. It simply had to be standing on the runway when it landed, flare pistol in hand, ready to walk out and take the surrender of an aircraft that had, until that moment, seemed almost impossible to beat.